If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know how hard it can be for employees to build meaningful connections with each other. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that, and they are called Mystery. Mystery has changed the way that I even think about employee engagement. They use the power of data and virtual events to drive employee connections. I actually recently attended a Mystery demo, and let me tell you, I learned so much about the potential behind employee engagement and how Mystery's events drive connection and belonging. So I'm excited to share that there is a special promotion for listeners of my podcast. Thanks to Mystery, you can get your first 2 Mystery events for the price of 1. That is right, 2 events for the price of 1. So if you're looking for a way to improve employee engagement and drive connection in your organization, I highly recommend checking them out. Go to trymystery.com/HR-podcast. That's trymystery.com/HR-podcast to get this special offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I have on the podcast this week Alex Gilbert, who is a New Yorker, a Mets fan, a yogi, a brunch enthusiast, and a new mom. And for all of you who have been listening for a while, you know that while I'm not a New Yorker, I am from New Jersey, and I'm a huge Mets fan. So this is what Alex and I actually connected on initially. So I'm really excited to have someone, akin to my love and passion on the podcast. But here's what you need to know about Alex. She is coming on this podcast to talk about a topic that we have not touched, which is learning disabilities in the workplace. So just so you know, Alex has dyslexia and ADHD. And after spending her career working in leadership development, she decided to start a consulting and coaching business that helps adults with learning disabilities and or ADHD like herself who have been struggling in their careers. Her business, Capable Consulting, was created to help them navigate their day-to-day workloads so that they feel supported and are able to reach their highest potential. Her biggest goal in creating Capable Consulting is to change the stigma surrounding learning disabilities and ADHD by reminding people what they are capable of. So without further ado, welcome Alex to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Same here, and congratulations on being a new mom. Your daughter is 4 months old.
Yes, she's 4 months old and just eating her cheeks all the time. It's the best.
That's amazing. Well, we will not be mad if she makes a surprise appearance, and also it's okay if she doesn't.
Okay.
The beauty of this podcast is that we are ourselves here, and I'm so grateful that you have so vulnerably and openly shared your experience and your life with us today. This is a topic that is really important and that we have not touched on. So to kind of kick us off, why don't you, I don't know, maybe take it away and tell us a little bit more about why your own experience with having learning disabilities has led you to create Capable Consulting.
Sure. So I think I'm kind of in the minority when it comes to this space. And I've even written on my website about the fact that I have such privilege in this disability space. I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD at 8 years old, which most of my clients who are coming to me are adults. I not only was diagnosed at that age, I had the privilege of having all kinds of resources all the way through college. But as I was preparing for college and I was working with an SAT tutor, she looked at me and said, "You don't really represent much on paper. I don't think you should be applying to big schools or anything like that." And I looked at her and I was like, Okay, but I might not represent, on paper in terms of my grades, but who I am as a person is also represented on paper."
Mm.
So I was sitting here so frustrated that she didn't see me as a whole person. Here I was on leadership teams. I was president of this club. I was in charge of this and that. And that was also on paper. And I thought, I have so many special and unique skills why don't you see that? And why don't other people see that? And I kind of had this in the back of my head that I really wanted to find ways to support people who were like me, who had learning disabilities or ADHD, and know that they had so many skills. And kind of fast forward through my career, as I had come into this world of having all these resources, I went to Indiana University and created a mentor retention program for students with disabilities. I knew how to advocate for myself. I knew how to teach other people how to advocate for themselves. This was something I was always passionate about. And then when I graduated, nothing exists for people in the workplace who have a learning disability or ADHD. And I was really, really struggling. And I was working in program and leadership development. And that was for over a decade. And then the pandemic hit and I lost my job due to COVID. And I thought, you know what? It's time. It's time to really give people who need the support my support, because so many people have been diagnosed with ADHD and learning disabilities during the pandemic because it's likely the first time they've ever sought therapy or really talked about these very intense feelings and things about themselves now. And I've had this lifetime of experience of going through all of these different scenarios and having resources. And I wanted to be there to remind people what they're capable of.
I love that. As you were sharing, and again, thank you for part of the magic in this and having a conversation is the vulnerability. And I know even in being vulnerable myself on my podcast, it can be quite difficult to do that. So I do really appreciate that you are openly sharing your experiences and your diagnoses with us, and the listeners. It's helpful.
I'm glad that it's helpful. And the thing is, so many of my clients also don't like to share their story because there is this intense guilt, shame, and I think that that's sad, that that's how society makes people feel about having something like this. And that's why I do like to share my story. One of my clients said to me, she's like, you give a voice to people who don't feel comfortable sharing. And that's what I want to do for you and make you feel a little less alone if you are part of this, category of people who have a learning disability or ADHD. So I'm always happy to be your voice, even if my story is nothing like your own. Mm-hmm. Your story is special and unique, and it deserves to be heard if you want it to be heard. But if you don't want it to be heard, I'm here to hear it in a smaller place or support you in a larger venue like this.
Amazing. I think this is the perfect segue. There were a few things running through my mind as you were kind of sharing the background to Capable and what led you out of like the traditional quote unquote 9 to 5, thanks to COVID. Many people had their lives uprooted in that way, which I'm sure at that time did not feel like such a blessing. But now maybe looking back, you're like, this was good.
It's so funny that you said that. I actually think it was. Everyone was like sitting, we were living in our Upper West Side apartment in our 550 square feet, which is, our glorified storage unit. And I had this, I was doing one of those like random quizzes on Instagram, and it was like a couple days leading up to the big layoffs that were happening in my company. And I had random questions, and I was like, oh, this will be fun. Like someone else got like, what's your favorite food? What was your first car? Who is your first teacher? I didn't get those questions. I got who inspires you? What is your dream job? And what do you love about yourself? And I stopped in my tracks because I was like, I cannot answer any of these. And then I got laid off a few days later. And I'm like,
wow,
I don't think that was a coincidence.
Yeah, it's like time to figure that out.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That's pretty incredible. And I guess this is one of the things, there were two things that I thought of. The first thing, I'm glad you mentioned Instagram, is that during COVID, especially, I don't know what led me to see so much of this. There was a lot of conversation and maybe this kind of comes back to your point that people were starting to confront their own realities and learn more about themselves and enroll in therapy and do things like that, right? But there were a lot of people saying that they had ADHD, undiagnosed, misdiagnosed.
Totally.
And I saw it a lot from female creators, women creators. And I am not in the business of judging or assuming one way or another, but I definitely noticed that there was this huge uptick in talking about it, but also in this, I don't know, like self-described, self-diagnosed reality, which can be the opposite of inclusive, right? It could make someone who actually has been diagnosed with ADHD feel like they're, they've been living their whole lives, and now it's the trendy thing to talk about. On the other hand, it could be, wow, this is normalizing what I've experienced my whole life. So what did you do? So it sounds like you noticed that. What are your thoughts?
I definitely noticed that. And the thing is, actually my husband just asked me this the other day. He said, when you started your business, you thought you were finding you. You thought you were finding people who had learning disabilities or ADHD and diagnosed at a young age and had resources and kind of had the rug pulled out from under them. What do you have now? And I said, almost none of that. I'm not saying that I don't work with people who were diagnosed at a young age. I do. But the majority of people who come to me are not in that category because people are getting diagnosed as adults. The biggest category of people who are getting a diagnosis of ADHD are adults. Sometimes it's because their kids were getting diagnosed because they were seeing their kids at home, trying to do Zoom school all day. Some of it came from TikTok and all of a sudden realizing, oh my God, I've had all of these symptoms for a really long time. It's a combination of that. I will also say that the amount of people who are getting diagnosed in this category are women and people of color, because women and girls show symptoms of ADHD very differently than boys. When you think of ADHD, you think of that hyperactive boy in class who's driving the teacher crazy. You don't think of the little girl sitting in class who might be part of the inattentive category, who is just kind of spaced out, or the hyperactive girl who is extra talkative and you see them as like the chatty one in class. That was how they were showing it. I have something called combined ADHD, which means that I am inattentive and hyperactive kind of at the same time. So I might in one moment be totally spaced out, but my mind is very hyperactive, going a million miles a minute, and I'm talking a million miles a minute. This is what it looks like in women and girls. So that was seen as, those are characteristics of girls. They're also taught in class, that's not how a lady acts, all that kind of stuff that, you mask for years because you don't know. People of color who are not diagnosed at the same rate as everybody else for a variety of different reasons, most of which are racist. But this is, this is the reality. So now you have people who are finally taking the initiative to not only self-diagnose, but seek the support of getting the help that they needed for a variety of reasons. And now feeling that support and saying, you're putting a name to something I've been feeling my whole life, and that is validating.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's really important, I think, for the listeners who are not familiar with ADHD or learning disabilities, which most of us potentially are not, unless we know someone or ourselves deal with this on a daily basis and have been diagnosed or one way or another. But I really encourage everyone to look at the show notes. I've included information from the Learning Disabilities of America. I think it's LDA.org, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, they have an incredible amount of resources. I was reading their website before our recording today, Alex, and it's just really interesting, even the way that people can get involved. And, I think one of the takeaways that we all probably have had since since 2020 and COVID and everything that, social justice movements, is that you don't have to experience it yourself to care or to be a part of changes, which is why, right? So this is really why this conversation, I think, is so important, because the listeners on the majority are in HR, they're in business,
Right.
they are decision makers or influence decision makers or are becoming decision makers. And learning disabilities, just like anything else, when we think about the ADA and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I say just like anything else because there are a ton of qualifiable diagnoses and characteristics that protect people under the ADA. Everything from alcohol addiction to drug addiction to rehabilitation to learning disabilities to physical disabilities, military leave. Like, we're talking about a slew of categories.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And I think from my experiences when I was in the workplace, those are actually none of what people think about in HR in their companies. I think the majority of people think of physical disabilities.
Right.
Every building that I was in had accessible bathrooms and accessible doors and entryways and exits, and that's amazing. I think we need to do more of that. And being in New York City, there's not a lot that was accessible in general, and
Yeah.
there needs to be more of that. But that is one category of a very, very large, vast category of disabilities.
Right.
And the type of disabilities that I'm referring to when I say learning disabilities or ADHD are very easily masked. They are not something that would show up that you would notice maybe right away. Or you might, as I said, someone who's, very chatty, you don't think anything of it. But they might have ADHD. They're just not sharing it. And it's very easy to not share that you have the disability. And so this is a challenge for a lot of people because they don't want to share, because they don't want people to think they're stupid or less than or incapable of their job. And therefore, they don't advocate for themselves or their needs. And there's a lot of companies who don't provide support because it's like a two-way street. If you don't ask and you don't know what you should give as support, nothing happens.
Yeah.
And so this is really, I was very excited to have this conversation because I think that this is a great way to kind of pair how we can support people, and not just people with learning disabilities or ADHD. The things that we can talk about are ways to make everybody more productive and inclusive in that way. So this is why I'm excited to be here.
Yes. And we're excited to have you. And, you bring up a really good point about the difference in what, I guess, let's say business leaders perceive as disabilities and requiring accommodation.
Exactly.
And so much of what I think this comes down to is the reality that people are basing things off of what they see. And
Exactly.
This is where physical disabilities, and again, as you mentioned, as they should be accommodated, as they need to be accommodated, become the first thing that people think about. But learning disabilities, neurodivergence, things like that are not necessarily seen. Or,
Right.
Maybe you don't identify them as something that is a diagnosed learning disability because we're not educated on that. So for the decision makers, the business leaders listening, what is the recommendation that you have to make sure that they are providing an inclusive workplace and being able to provide accommodations to people who do, have a qualified, or I should say a learning disability that has, that they, of course, are able to back up in saying that they need accommodations for?
Sure. I think there's a lot of things that companies can do. I'll say on the most lowest level is providing resources such as Grammarly and Speechify. These are two programs that can be downloaded on any browser or any computer, and they have free and paid versions. Both I think are great. But if your company automatically was handing everybody their laptops with these programs already on it, it would be amazing. Grammarly checks exactly what it sounds like. It checks all of your grammar. It tells you the tones of your emails. It tells you if your sentences don't make sense. It tells you if you said there was an attachment and there's not an attachment. It tells you grammar just in general. It'll say like you use too many exclamation marks. Hence, I'm a millennial. Like things.
I was going to say
things
that
like
called me out. Yeah.
Exactly. It calls me out too. So those kinds of services can be so helpful to everyone, because how many times did you just send an email and say, oh, I didn't mean to send that. I forgot to do that, or whatever the case is. That's helpful for everybody. Speechify is a really wonderful program because it reads everything to you. And there are very long emails that you get, or very long documents. Yeah. And even if you are someone who is, not in the neurodivergent category, doesn't have a learning disability or anything like that, you're currently listening to a podcast. How helpful is that for you to listen, maybe while you're doing something else? So if your documents could be read to you off of your screen, or your emails could be read to you while you're trying to do something else, isn't that more helpful? Those kinds of programs can be great. I think talking to your management and talking to them about how they talk to their staff, saying, this is what my needs are. What are yours? Just by opening the conversation of saying, like, I'm not perfect at everything I do. This is where I need help. This is what it looks like if you could provide that support for me, and vice versa. That's just like, again, on little notes. If you're in the office providing noise canceling headphones for anybody, or different physical quiet spaces that people can rent out if they need to, that's kind of like a little less, neon lights, essentially, of those fluorescent lights in New York City buildings in particular are just
they're the worst.
Next level awful. But if you had something that had more dim lighting, you and I were sitting here and I was like, my lights are too bright. I can't focus. And I had to lower my lights. It's very little that I'm talking about that makes a tremendous difference for someone who has a learning disability or ADHD, but really everybody, productivity wise. And one thing I did not mention, long meetings. Long meetings are the productivity killer for someone who has a learning disability or ADHD. You have very intense amount of time sitting in one place. A lot of the times, 50% of it is not relevant to them, so they are not paying attention. Nor is the person who doesn't have a learning disability or ADHD, because they are too long. So I always recommend, if you need to have these very long meetings, one, kind of sending a timeline as to what's happening in certain parts of the meeting at what time, sending some kind of an agenda with an actual outline, recording the meetings, sending out transcripts with notes afterwards so that someone could look back and say, oh, I know someone mentioned this. Let me see. That is helpful for everybody too.
These are really important distinctions and resources. And I wrote down Grammarly and Speechify, so I will be sure to link those in the show notes also. Yeah. I've used Grammarly. It's great. I studied English in college, and I still use Grammarly because actually it's really good if you want to also focus on inclusivity and removing words that don't drive inclusivity. So it's amazing for that.
It's such a great program.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's not lost on me that there could be listeners who are like, Alex is talking about me. I'm that person who has a neurodivergent diagnosis or reality or with a learning disability. And so what can someone who is listening who does live with a learning disability or ADHD, what can they do to feel maybe more secure in bringing this up? Because I know that there are stigmas. I have many, many, many people in my life who do live with learning disabilities or ADHD and never tell anyone because they don't want a discriminatory practice. They don't want to be looked at differently. They don't want to be treated differently. And the reality is that sometimes people are, and it's not right. And it's just because of a lack of what I would imagine a lack of knowledge. So what can someone do to feel better about talking about it?
I think this is something I talk about on a daily, weekly basis. Here I was at the beginning of this podcast, and you were commending me for talking about so openly my disability and giving people a voice. A lot of people don't feel comfortable doing it, and you just named half the reasons why. What I will say is that everyone is advocating for themselves in some way, shape, or form
Hmm.
for a variety of different reasons, whether it was because of a disability or because, I don't know, let's say you had somebody who was sick with COVID in your family and now you are the sole caretaker. Maybe you have kids. I could name 100 reasons why you need to advocate for yourself in the workplace. That being said, you need to know what you're advocating for. I always say this, you need to go into a conversation, know what you want out of the conversation. So you don't have to say, I have dyslexia, I have ADHD, I have anxiety or depression or anything like that. You could say, we're talking about those meetings, for example. Let's say you had meetings structured in your company and you had a lot of them several times a week. Can you say to your boss, I'm trying to focus on X, Y, or Z project, and a lot of these meetings are breaking up the time of my focus. Is there a way that I could participate in half of the meeting, or let me know what's relevant, or send me the notes of this? Is there a way to better use my time? Something like that. You're having an open conversation with your manager. They could sit there and be like, you know what? Yeah, but no one is having those conversations, which is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We just kind of go about our day and say, like, well, this is how we do things. Well, does
Yeah.
this work for you? Because a lot of the times when I have these conversations with managers and employees who are trying to have conversations with their managers, they often sit back and think, like, this doesn't really actually work for me either. So why aren't we reevaluating all of it? Um,
Yeah.
just know that you bringing something up and having an idea as to where you'd like the conversation to go, you don't have to share why. And I don't think people realize that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, actually. The why, and from a legal standpoint, actually, when we think about, let's just say, those listening, your business leaders in an HR function, if someone brings to you, a doctor's note saying, "Hey, I'm going to have to be out for a week," we can't ask why. We can't ask
True.
specifically what the medical diagnosis is or what the medical reason is. Just that we have to understand that this is there's a reason for the person to be out. It's qualified by a doctor, and we, whatever accommodations are required, we then follow that process to have an interactive discussion, as we call it in the accommodation process. And actually, I think it's a great point that you make, that the same goes for this other side of the medical diagnostic reality when it comes to our legal obligations and what we can and cannot do from a legal standpoint. And I think it's a really fair point that people don't have to explain why, and that they're asking for, if at the end of the day, if it's seen as an accommodation from an employer, if an employer is like, hey, this is something, like, we don't have the ability to go to recorded meetings. Let's just say randomly, this is their pushback. And then it's like a matter of having to share that this is an accommodation. There probably is a way to go about this without revealing something that someone is not comfortable revealing. Do you feel like that's a...
Totally. And even if let's say it's an in-person meeting and you can't have it physically recorded, you don't have somebody who could take notes to send it back out. I mean, that is like,
Yeah.
that is meetings 101. I have been in board meetings for like organizations and clubs that I've been in since high school and middle school. And there was always a note taker. There's always a way to make accommodations that are not just helpful for that one person, but really truly helpful for everybody. So that's my point, is you don't have to say, You literally don't have to say, I have ADHD. I have dyslexia. You don't have to. No one's pushing you. I personally like to have shared that because I actually think that's what made me really unique at my jobs and why people hired me for my jobs, because I had very unique skills that other people didn't have because of those disabilities. But you don't have to share for the sake of sharing. You can share what your needs are in this environment, and all the things that we're talking about are things that are actually helpful for everyone.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, when we think about folks who do have learning disabilities, including those that maybe are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, it's hard to find statistics on these individuals. And I was sharing this with Alex before we started recording, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a website that, it's run by the government. These are all like, statisticians and analysts that pull all of this incredible information together, probably from the census and other documents. But basically they lump in all disabilities into one category, which is so problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, a disability could be a mental illness. It could be an addiction. It could be a physical ailment. It could literally be any of those covered disabilities that we just talked about under the ADA.
Right.
And we just also talked about the difficulty in realizing, I should say, not even the difficulty, the importance in realizing that disabilities are different and accommodations look different based on disability. And now we have a category of folks with disabilities, learning disabilities specifically, who are underrepresented in accommodations with the workplace, now being lumped into a category that is generalized. And so it's really hard to it's hard to understand why that's happening.
There is so many can of worms with that. I don't even know where to start with it. I can narrow it down a little bit for you in terms of what I have read and been working with. There's about 4% that we're aware of people who have learning disabilities or ADHD in the workplace. But of that 4%, 60% of them get fired.
Wow.
So that's the alarming part. Those are the numbers that I think are things we need to focus on. One, because you just talked about the fact that some people don't have a diagnosis. Some people don't even know they have some of these disabilities. And we were talking earlier about the fact that people who are in this category of being diagnosed with ADHD or learning disabilities are adults. And there are no real true resources for adults who have a learning disability or ADHD. They are for kids, they are for parents, they are for educators. That's it.
Wow.
Which is why I wanted to do what I'm doing, which is give adults support that doesn't really exist elsewhere. And the part of the reason that people are getting fired from these jobs are a lot of the reasons that we were talking about before, of these places not necessarily being inclusive to their needs. There's also a lot of people with ADHD and executive dysfunction that really struggle with deadlines and, handing things on time or being late in general. Just anything that has to do with time, blindness, time management. That people are really nervous about being seen as someone who has a disability. They take on way more than they could or should. They overcompensate. They actually accomplish very little because they are just taking on as much as they can because they want to be seen as the person who can do it all. They're people pleasers, so they're really trying to do all of those things. Their intentions are pure as can be, but they just don't know how to manage the day-to-day, and they're afraid to speak up. And those are the people who tend to get fired often. So there's that. I specifically made a course because of this on helping people transition into new jobs, because I wanted people to feel supported and know that they could find environments that are right for them, but also based on their own skills. And I will say, from the reverse side of being in HR and being the kind of place that I'm trying to have people look for is having something on their site that doesn't necessarily just say that, you're disability friendly or that you're inclusive. Like inclusivity, when you're talking DEI, is literally, you're talking a even more vast, like,
Yeah.
group, because now we're talking about race and ethnicity and religion and everything else in between. So, it's one thing to just write examples of, to say that DEI friendly or inclusive or whatever that you're writing on your website, but showing it, you
Mm.
know, how can you show that, not just in your physical space? What types of things do you provide for your employees? Do you have flexible work hours? Is that something that you're putting on your job application so that you can be accommodating to, again, not just somebody who has a disability, but someone who's, you know, needs more flexible hours because 9 to 5 isn't realistic for their day anymore. You know, you talk about flexible workspaces that a lot of people are like, now you can work from home,
Mm.
or you work in the office, or you can have both. What other things are you doing like that? Because if you're doing more things that are inclusive, I want people to know that.
Yeah. First of all, you mentioned the number 4% or the percentage 4% as
Right.
far as what we know for individuals who are in the workplace and working with or have a learning disability. I broke it down. I took out my calculator because I could not do this mental
Okay.
math. But that
I can't do the
represents
math anyway, so even with a
if we have
calculator.
100 people that we're looking at, 100 people in the workplace, 4% is 4 people. So you said that 60% of that 4% is getting fired. That represents
Uh-huh.
2 to 3 people out of that group of 4.
Uh-huh.
That's major. That could be one entire department.
Correct.
Right. So I feel like, people really listening to this really need to understand the magnitude of that number, that an entire department could be uprooted based on the lack of accessibility and inclusivity in the practices within a workplace to provide not just reasonable accommodations, but again, like inclusive opportunities and resources and access for people with learning disabilities without having to ask who has a learning disability. Like, let's just provide it. Just like we should be providing equal opportunity and need to provide equal opportunity to people of different backgrounds, races, religions, genders, etc. And, this point that you made on workplace and flexible work hours and remote working, there has been, I don't know if it came out of the whole Twitter debacle, but there was something that I remember, I'm not quoting this correctly, but someone I think is suing Elon Musk for removing the remote work option because they are saying that it violated their rights as a protected a person with a disability as a protected class. Now, I could be misquoting this, but I'm pretty sure that I'm like 95% accurate with this, and I'll look it up in a moment. But those options for remote work, hybrid working, flexible work hours, is there some sort of statistic or understanding amongst the community of folks living with learning disabilities that those options are supremely helpful compared to having like a 9 to 5 and being in a standard office or work environment?
I haven't looked into this specifically.
And I just looked it up. Basically what it says is disabled employee sues Twitter over Musk's ban on remote work. So the employee is not suing Elon Musk, but is suing Twitter for the remote work ban because basically the long hours at high intensity discriminates against workers with disabilities, as this new lawsuit claims. And I will add that link for sure in the show notes as well. But this is actually pointing to what you were sharing before about long meetings and things like that. But yes, go ahead with the workplace.
So to kind of go through the whole working from home piece versus working in the office, I have clients who prefer to physically be in their office because they don't necessarily have the same distractions that they would have at home. I have clients who only want to work from home because they can use their noise canceling headphones. They can set up their environment to feel more successful, I've seen everything and anything in between. Um, the part that I want to focus on is the fact that this 9 to 5 is unrealistic for most people, and it
Mm-hmm.
is such an archaic time frame that was created, I'm pretty sure, in like the 1800s.
Yeah,
This
I think it was because of like I'm not going to assume, but
this like 40-hour work week. Now there's all these articles about how actually a 4-day work week is actually way more productive as is like a 6-hour day. People with ADHD in particular have this amazing ability to hyper focus, which means that they could sit for 2-3 hours at a time, do all of their work for the week sometimes, and kind of walk away. But now you are sitting them in a desk, excuse me, you are sitting them at a desk and saying, you have to be here from 9 to 5. And then they are so bored and they don't know what
Mhm.
to do with themselves. And then they don't necessarily get the other things done because they have to physically sit in a space that is just not great for them. I would say that goes for a lot of people, and I'm not dismissing that why it's a challenge for people with ADHD. But I think that that's something that people have come to realize because of COVID, that they might work better at different times of the day.
For sure.
And sometimes they are more focused in the morning than they are in the afternoon. Sometimes they're more focused in the afternoon than they are in the morning. The point is, people have to get to know themselves and get to know what their needs are so that they can actually focus on those times and set those schedules for themselves. And I think that is not necessarily available in a lot of workplaces, of like being able to make your own schedule, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. This is something, I mean, I've talked about this at nauseum on the podcast, that there is such an importance to providing flexible work arrangements for everyone. And I am confident in saying that every single person wants to have or needs to have the ability to say that they have autonomy in what their work life looks like. And I don't know anyone that would say, oh no, I'd rather my boss tell me exactly when to work. Like, who's going to,
No one,
yeah, no one's
no
going to
one is
say,
saying that. Yeah,
yeah.
no, I'm with you. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to bring up, is that yes, these statistics are alarming. Yes, the percentage of people that I'm talking about are small, but all the things that I'm talking about that will help the people who have learning disabilities or ADHD thrive in these places is making accommodations that really benefit everybody. But I
Mm-hmm.
haven't really touched on the one most important part to me, is knowing that people with ADHD and learning disabilities are incredibly skilled and should be valued in your workspace for a variety of different reasons. And yes, this percentage is small, but what they contribute is so large to your culture, to your creativity in your space, to your problem solving abilities in your workspace. I mean,
Yeah.
I was hired in my last job specifically because I was dyslexic and had ADHD. I had the ability to see the big picture and the little details all at once. My creativity in this space was that far beyond what someone who doesn't have this disability is. The execution value is not always there, and it might take me longer to do this, but those are the people you want sitting at your like tables to help
Mm-hmm.
you problem solve, because we can see things that other people can't, and we can fix them quicker than other people can do. So I think that that is something we should talk about too.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point that, part of the stigma, I would imagine, is that again, we talked about this, that there's this fear of being seen differently or as inadequate or incompetent. And that is just it's not right and it's not fair. And the best thing that we can do to not only promote inclusivity and provide opportunity is to make sure that our DE&I scope at our organizations includes people with learning disabilities, because there is an unspoken approach here. I mean, we just talked about how the BLS and other organizations that provide an understanding into what percentage of people are working with learning disabilities, and that is because there is not a whole lot of conversation about how that person is affected or influential in or influenced by their workplace. So I hope that the listeners are walking away thinking about how they can make sure that there are seats at the table for people who have different, backgrounds and experiences and who have learning disabilities. And I think that it's the same conversation in my eyes, or in my opinion, as to why we have to talk about DE&I not only holistically but also specifically, making sure that we're looking at demographics and breakdowns. And actually, this is one area that I would love to kind of broach before we end the episode. But, when people are applying to jobs, there's a question about whether or not they have a disability. And most of the time, employers are not looking at this. I can probably say most of the time, but yeah, okay. Go ahead. I see you're going to say something.
I was just going to say that's interesting because a lot of reasons. I have to pause because she's screaming. So
go ahead. OMG.
I might have to do this bouncing.
Oh, but, that's okay. Oh my gosh, she's adorable.
Thank you. Say hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh my gosh, look at those cheeks.
I know.
She's a blondie.
She's blonde and green eyes. All right, I might have to bounce and answer this question.
That's okay. This is reality.
This is reality.
This is reality. What I was basically trying to get at there is that there's a whole opportunity for us to better understand our population and to see demographics holistically, not just gender and race, but also inclusive of learning disabilities and how we make our decisions and evaluate our success at being inclusive.
Yes. And it's interesting that you say that because I think a lot of people don't want to check that box for all of those reasons. I will say sometimes even when I did check the box, I immediately got a no thank you. Because disability, again, is so broad. It's so broad, and people are like, oh no, do I have to accommodate for this? I think that they can't outright say that they denied it for that reason. But I, as someone who would talk about my disability openly, never checked that box.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get those interviews. And I will say, not to toot my own horn on this one, but interviewing was always my best skill. And that was something that I always wanted to do, was I could get in the room and I could have a conversation. There was no job I wasn't going to be offered. And honestly, that's kind of how it went. So every time I clicked the box disability, I didn't get into the conversation. But when I did get to those interviews, I said outright, sorry, that's my daughter.
She is a welcome guest on this podcast, as are you.
Thank you. So I was saying that it was the first thing that I said on every single interview is I'm dyslexic and have ADHD. And here's what's unique about my skills that you want in your workplace. And I was very open about that. So it was one thing to check a box and not get an interview. It was another to not check the box, get the interview, tell them that I had the disability. And then I continued on with my path and had no reason to, be denied something. But it's really hard. I know that a lot of people in HR say that they don't look at it. And I'm sure there's a lot of companies where that's true. But I will also say, being the person who's checked it, it's not a coincidence that I had received pretty much every single one of them within an hour of no thank you.
Wow.
And not once did that happen after I actually had an interview.
I'm really glad you shared this because it's an important point to make. that I see this all the time in my DMs when people tell me nightmarish stories about how they're being treated in the workplace. I'm like, how is this even possible? How is it possible that people are still doing these things, right? And it's, I can easily say that, people don't look at it, but the reality is that for you, it certainly feels that they are making a preconceived judgment or a snap judgment without getting to know what your skill set is and the value that you bring to an organization. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, and as I said, people with learning disabilities and ADHD have so many strengths, like unbelievable. The amount of entrepreneurs that are dyslexic or have ADHD is like astronomical. And there's a reason for it. There's a reason because they don't feel necessarily like the places that they're in are accommodating, and it's hard to work for other people. But the other part is the fact that they're really creative and have visions for things and know how to get things done in a very efficient manner. Like, why wouldn't you want to have that in your own space? It's
right.
So, and that's really why I so openly talk about this, because not only do I want companies to understand those skills, but I want people who have the disabilities to also see themselves as somebody who has these tremendous strengths and has something to contribute.
I love that. I don't think there's a better way to end. And for everyone listening, you can get in touch with Alex. You can better understand what you can do to support individuals in the workplace who have learning disabilities, or if you are an individual with a learning disability, I hope that you heed Alex's message that you can do all of the things that you are great at, no matter whether you are open about what you experience and what you live with, or whether you're not. It is totally your decision to make. But Alex, I really appreciate you, again, being so vulnerable and open with us, and for sharing information that I have yet to talk about until this point. So thank you for educating all of us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad I could be here and help your audience really make this a much more inclusive place. And so does my daughter. She's very happy about that too.
Yes. If this is not inclusivity, I don't know what is.
I know. This is real life mamapreneur, or what I think they call that.
Yes.
Yeah, my days are crazy, and this is what it looks like. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Having this flexibility is something that I think a lot of places really should be okay with, because I am super efficient with my few hours in between.
Right. I love it. Well, so that I can make sure everyone knows where to connect with you, and I will certainly put it in the show notes as well. If someone wants to connect with you about Capable, or even just your own story, where can they do that? What's the best way to connect?
So you can always go to my website, which I spell Capable my own way. I spell it CAPE, able, because I wanted people to see themselves as capable. But 2, I spell everything wrong because I'm dyslexic, and 3, because I wanted them to see it as their superpower. So you can find my website at capableconsulting.com, or you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at I am capable, which, as I said, was CAPE, or on Facebook and LinkedIn, it's Capable Consulting LLC.
Amazing. Alex, thank you so much. Special thanks to the special appearance from your daughter as well. I love it. I think this actually might be the first time that we have had someone under the age of 18 on the podcast.
There you go. And I give permission. You can't see her, but it's okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, her face will not be in it, but her presence certainly will be.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.